Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think some of you made your way to campus and to the classroom through the rain. So glad you're here. I just want to welcome everyone in the community, our campus colleagues and friends. My name is Tanya Velasquez. I'm an associate teaching professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, Ethnic, Gender, and Labor Studies. I'm also a co-PI for UW-Tacoma's first, maybe not last, Anna Peasy program and grant. I'm also they're moderating today's panel, title which is Counter Narratives, How Critical Asian American Scholars Disrupt Institutional Racism in Higher Education and Beyond. This event is co-sponsored by UW-Tacoma AAPI Thrive. Our project is a special campus-wide initiative under the Office of the Chancellor and the School of Education. I'm very honored to introduce to you to our Chancellor, Dr. Sheila Edwards Lang, who will open this event. Let's give Dr. Lang a warm welcome.
And hopefully I can do this. Some of you know that I had a sinus infection about 3 weeks ago, and as a result, ended up with laryngitis. And so by the end of the day, my voice is very strange and cracking. So welcome to those of you who are visiting our campus for the first time. Just so happy to see you here. I want to start with our land acknowledgement, which we do at our events here at UW-T. And if you get a chance, you'll also see the land acknowledgement that the Puyallup tribe did for us on the wall outside as part of building this building. It is absolutely beautiful, and they carved it especially for us, acknowledging the relationship that we have with the Puyallup tribe. So the Tacoma community acknowledges that we learn, teach, work, and live on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. In particular, our campus is situated on the traditional lands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. We recognize that this is a difficult and painful history, and we understand we must play an active role in remembering not just what happened to indigenous communities post-settlement, but also the rich history that existed long before colonization. This land acknowledgement is a small act in an ongoing process of honoring the past while working together with local tribes to build a more inclusive and thoughtful community. So as Tanya mentioned, we were just awarded the Anna Peasy grant in the fall, and it's a 5-year grant that started last fall. Today's event is meaningful because one of the deliverables of that grant is that we do more to provide more Asian studies courses, Asian American Studies courses here at UW-T. And so it also supports our students, our community relationships, and so very important work that we're going to be doing. I just want to, I don't know if they're going to be acknowledged and thanked, but every opportunity I have to thank these three for stepping forward, and that's Cassie Mura, Tanya Velasquez, and Rachel Indo, for stepping forward when they were very busy to put this grant in again, because we had applied for it multiple times and didn't get it. And I think we were all sort of tired. We were just coming back from COVID. It was a very tiring time, but they and Patrick Powell, who is here, really felt like this was so important that we needed to muster the strength and put it forward again, and they did. So I want to thank those three co-PIs for their vision and their work on bringing this to UW-T. Today's event. So this is our official kickoff to the API Thrive Project. It includes a panel discussion among nationally recognized scholars of Asian American Studies. They will critically reflect with us on topics such as the genealogy of anti-Asian violence in relation to Black Lives Matter and other racial justice movements, and ways that Asian American scholars are able to disrupt institutional racism in higher education through equity-conscious advocacy, community engagement, pedagogies, and scholarship. Our goal is to continue working towards cross-racial solidarities and seek coalitions for change at UW-T and beyond. And I just want to say, I was talking to Eric, one of the panelists, about my time being a campus diversity officer. And I said, this work is so important that we do it in partnership with community, because our students are coming to us from community. Our faculty and staff, when they leave this campus, they go out and they live in community. And so their ability to thrive on our campuses really depends on their relationships out in community, not just on campus. We have to do our part to make sure that our community, our campus community is welcoming, but we can do that best when we partner with community. So I want to acknowledge that there are some community partners in the audience today. I want to thank you for coming and for being part of this. And I'm sure that we are in for a treat from these panelists today. So thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you again for this project.
I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Today, we have 4 guests joining us as Asian Americanists in their respective fields of study. They're academic leaders who serve and sit as department chairs, center directors, and deans. Our panel will critically reflect on how their lived experiences as Asian Americans and people of color have shaped how they've approached advocacy and life in academia as scholars, activists, and especially from a cross-racial perspective that centers anti-racism, which we're all called to do in our work and in our lives. I do want to clarify a key point. We will have another panel in the future that features Pacific Islander scholars, because critical ethnic studies scholars and activists and community members have rightfully insisted on recognizing the distinctions between and within various AAPI groups, even though these broad political categories still exist as racial projects in the U.S. So today's event is the start of many conversations we'll have about Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islander histories in their relationship with the histories of others in the United States. In this way, the AAPI Thrive project will contribute to our ability to become a student-ready university that understands and is prepared to serve, teach, and learn with such diverse communities. Our first panelist to my left is Dr. Kevin Roxas. He's a dean and professor of Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University. His research examines 3 interrelated areas of concern: the often inequitable nature of the social context of reception in school and communities for immigrant and refugee youth, the dynamic creation of adolescent identity for immigrant and refugee youth in response to systems of oppression and discrimination, and how pre-service and service teachers and social service providers can and must critically examine and reconceptualize the ways in which they respond to the needs of these students in their classrooms and local communities. His work is informed by his parents' immigration from the Philippines to the U.S. and their experiences and that of their children in navigating schools and higher education in the U.S. He has published more than 20 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including the Harvard Educational Review, Educational Studies, the Journal of Latinos in Education, and Educational Leadership. In 2019, the National Association of Multicultural Education named Dr. Roxas the Carl A. Grant Outstanding Research Award. Kevin is also the editor of Multicultural Perspectives. Let's welcome Dr. Roxas. Dr. Rachel Indo is founding dean and professor of the School of Education at UW-Tacoma. We're so fortunate to have her. She is also principal investigator of our campus's API Thrive project, a scholar of Asian and Asian American education, transnational studies in Asian America, and urban education. Dr. Indo is the author of multiple publications, including The Incarceration of Japanese Americans in the 1940s, Literature for the High School Classroom. The National Council of Teachers of English, she was the winner of the 2020 Skipping Stones Award for Excellent Teaching Resource. Dr. Indo has been recognized internationally for her commitment to equity and excellence in education. Examples of recent international awards received since 2017 include 3 awards from the American Educational Research Association for distinguished contributions to education research and for excellence in mentorship. I can speak to that personally. She is excellent. The Arthur R. King Jr. Award for Curriculum Innovation and Promoting Equity in Education through the Pacific Consortium Circle, and the Carl Grant Excellence in Research Award from the National Association for Multicultural Education. Welcome, Dr. Indo. Excuse me. Dr. Rick Bowness is chair and professor in the Department of American Ethnic Studies at UW Seattle. Dr. Bowness is primarily a scholar of American, ethnic, and Asian American studies, but he also has strong interest in the conjunctions among American studies, Pacific Islander studies, and Southeast Asian studies, particularly as they deal with the historical and contemporary phenomenon of migration, transnationalism, interdisciplinary work, and multicultural pedagogy and mentorship. He is the author of Locating Filipino Americans, Ethnicity and the Cultural Politics of Space, co-editor of Filipinx American Studies, Reckoning, Reclamation, Transformation, and Contemporary Asian American Communities, as well as several essays and book chapters. His latest book, The Ocean in the School, is based on an ethnography of Pacific Islander and other underrepresented students whose college experiences become generative sites for critiquing and transforming university schooling. Currently, he is editor-in-chief of ALAN, Journal of Filipinx American Studies and Diaspora Studies. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Dr. Eric Tang. He's the director of the Center of Asian American Studies and the associate professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department at UT Austin. His first book, Unsettled: Cambodian Refugees in the New York City Hyper-Ghetto, is an ethnographic account of refugee life in some of New York City's most impoverished and socially marginalized neighborhoods. A former community organizer, Dr. Tang has published several articles on race and urban social movements, including award-winning writing on post-Katrina New Orleans. Locally, his research focuses on the past and present of racial segregation in Austin, Texas, paying particular attention to the gentrification-driven displacements of the city's longstanding African-American residents. He co-authored the report, Outlier: The Case of Austin's Declining African-American Population, which revealed that Austin was the only major growing city in the United States to experience an absolute numerical decline in African-Americans. Please help us welcome Dr. Tang. We're so fortunate to have all four of you here together to be a part of a really important conversation for our students and for our campus community. I know you have the questions there in front of you. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and we'll hope to maybe give each of you about 3 to 5 minutes with each prompt, and you can choose how you'd like to respond and take turns. Number one, can you briefly share, what you're comfortable with, of course, how your own intersecting identities shaped your K-12 and university education, and now your experiences in the academy as a leader and a scholar? And I would say, in short, what brought you to this moment, and who do you bring with you?
So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I think the first thing I want to say is to center the students who attend this institution, to center those students who might not see themselves represented in the curriculum that is here, but who show up every day to learn and who are hungry for that knowledge. That we all, I'm a professor at Western Washington University, that we all as professors need to provide them. That is our responsibility. So I just want to start with centering that. And I'll start with, go from there to, I was thinking about my remarks for the day. I've thought about this a lot in my life. I went to kindergarten twice. That's a long story. And from kindergarten to 8th grade, I cannot recall having a teacher of color in my experience. I went to high school, grades 9 through 12. I cannot recall having a teacher of color in that high school. I went to a university for 4 years. I cannot recall having a teacher of color in that space. I went to graduate school for my PhD and for my master's before that, and I also cannot recall a teacher of color in those spaces. And I call that out into this space to show or to say, to underscore that to me then there was, and by the way, in addition, very little, if nothing, in the curriculum itself in terms of representing my experiences or my family's experiences. My mother was one of 17 children. She grew up about 2 hours south of the Philippines, Manila, in a small rural village. She was one of 17 children. She was the first one to leave the Philippines to find work as a nurse in Chicago roughly 60 years ago. My father left about the same time to go to university. He didn't go, different story. And they met, and then they started to have children. And they raised us in these schools where we just weren't represented. We weren't represented by teachers who were there, and we weren't represented by the curriculum that was there. And I just underscore that because, I see that now, I've seen that now in my adulthood years, kind of the sadness in that, the lack of that, the holes in my own life. And of course, I could have read on my own, but how would I have known better if teachers themselves or professors such as yourselves weren't pushing for that in the curriculum? And so I think I'll probably just, I'll just kind of stop there. I guess one other thing I'll say is, I remember as a child in schools, there were other students who had immigrated, their families had immigrated to the United States. Two other students in my grade school class, we went together from like kindergarten to grade 6. We were all like from Filipino families. But I remember it was some unspoken bond that we just wouldn't talk about it at school. Even though on the weekends we would go to the Filipino Cultural Center and participate in events together, because there was a smaller group of Filipino families at that time when I was younger, eons ago, where we would get together, but it was unspoken that we wouldn't talk about it. And I'll just leave it with you to think for now, why was that so? Like, who was the adult in that room? And in this case, who was the adult at the university saying, well, we need to do something different for I believe it's about 25 to 30% students at this university who are from these groups.
Use my big girl voice. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Also, like what Dr. Rock says, shout out to the students. You are just incredible. So thank you just for being you and for inspiring me to do better as a human being and as a leader and as a faculty member. So thank you, students.
Yes.
So I was born and raised in a predominantly white community in Nebraska. My mom is like me, she's Japanese American, was born and raised in the United States. And what I didn't learn about until I was in college was we descend from Japanese nationals who were legally denied the right to citizenship in this country, which had ramifications in terms of our ability to own property, to testify in the court of law. I didn't learn about this until college. My dad is from Japan. He came to the United States in the early 70s, which was not even 10 years after two key pieces of civil rights legislation. One was 1964, folks, come on, what is it? Students.
Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the other was the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Reform Act. If you are not aware about how these two key pieces of legislation are connected, I would urge you to learn more, because when we reflect on our history and histories, it's not individualistic. It's intimately connected to other groups of color, especially African Americans, all right? So there's two things that I think about when I reflect on my K-12 experience. All I would say it was traumatizing, but like Dr. Rock says, erasure and invisibility. I didn't have an educator of color until I went to college. The school board, the school leaders were all white. The curriculum was completely whitewashed. Their idea of diversity was white women and periodically the sprinkle of really pejorative stereotypes of the continent and very Orientalist stereotypes of Asian folks. On the other end is hypervisibility. And so when you're just one of a few kids of color, you're often subject to racial violence. And I'll share one story. So when I was in middle school, my homegirls and I were walking home from school, and this gang of white girls came up to us and started beating us up. And then I'll never forget this. This white girl opened her backpack. She had a water gun with bleach and started spraying us up on that, our hair and clothing. The worst part about this was the next day, one of our teachers found out about this white woman, and she thought it was funny. And this was a teacher that I respected and loved. And so that was really difficult for me. Because school wasn't for me, for a lot of middle-class white kids, school is cool, school is safe and affirming. and fun, well, not for my peers and me. So I got into some brush-ups with the law, and so I spent a lot of my locked up in juvenile detention facilities and in the foster care system. So I missed a lot of school, was seen as kind of the low kid, the stupid kid, the one who was not teachable. And then so college was not really seen as an option. But luckily, I did have some great teachers who encouraged me to go to college. And so I started off at the community college system and then eventually was able to attend a university very similar to UW-Tacoma. First generation student, served by a TRIO program. And so I just share all of this because, I know many of our students, you come from similar contexts, and a lot is possible, and a lot of time the power of representation does matter. So, and also what I would say is that my experiences are not isolated. I know that many of us have had these shared experiences.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. Congratulations to UW-Tacoma for the Ana PC grant. That's fantastic. My name is Rick Bonus. I'm Filipino by ancestry, like Dr. Ross. I was born in the Philippines. I came to the United States when I was 7. I grew up in Southern California. I was always mistaken for a Mexican, which is fine, but that goes to show how invisible most of the time Filipinos are, or unknown to a lot of people. Even though people like myself, just like other Asian American groups and other groups, much better. Sexy bedroom voice. All right, cool. Many countries in Asia have a long encounter with the United States even before coming to the United States. And so it's kind of ironic that a lot of us are unknown or invisible in the US when, as a matter of fact, we've been exposed to American culture, and US people have known us even before, and that's for colonization and imperialism in the Pacific and in Asia. I come from a very working class background. My parents both thought that becoming a professor was kind of weird for me, right? Because they think that proper work means wearing, boots and helmet and uniform. And reading books is sort of unproductive labor for my mom. And so to this day, I try to convince them that that's not the case. I have many facets to my life. Of course, work is just part of it. I am so honored and privileged to be living the legacies of the student advocacies of the Black Student Union and their allies at the University of Washington in Seattle. I saw a slide that sort of showed that, right? For San Francisco State University. UW-Seattle and the Black Student Union are celebrating their 55th year, 1968 to 2023, when a group of Black students and their allies stormed the president's office, Gerberding Hall, 55 years ago to demand to be treated number one in their list in their letter to the president. Number one, to be treated as human beings, and number two, to have for students like themselves to know and learn and study and critique their own history and culture, which at that time was not offered at all on campus. So students were demanding that their university be more meaningful towards them, be more accountable to them. They were demanding that their university change for them. And they were successful. And I'm benefiting from that legacy to this day. We're celebrating the 55th year in May, and I invite all of you to come to our campus. I'm sure we're going to have some partnerships with all the other campuses as well, because this is a system-wide transformation that happened 55 years ago. The Black Student Union protest started the Black Studies program, which 3 years later started the American Ethnic Studies program that I now chair. I came to the UW in 2000. This was my first job straight out of graduate school, and I'm still here. I still complain about the weather. I come from very sunny Southern California, and this is what we have here, but I've managed to stay. A big part of my life is also my mentorship of students. I have a very long-standing sort of relationship with students that go all the way back to when I started. When I started as a professor in Seattle at the University of Washington, on my second day on the job, a Chamorro student, a Samoan American student, a Hawaiian student, a black student, and a Filipino student hugged me, went to my office, gave me a hug, and told me, "Welcome to our university. This is our community." This was a coalition of students at that time, which I didn't know existed among a lot of different racial groups, speaking about intersections between not only Asian American and Pacific Islander students, but also with other students. And they said, "We are the students responsible for your hire." We went to Gilbertine Hall to demand that the university hire a specialist in either Vietnamese American Studies or Filipino American Studies. And I didn't know this, but they revealed to me, because they were part of the search, that 200 people applied and I was number one. And they told me, "You better do your job." And so I said, "I promise you I will." I cried. I did not know. They had candle vigil nights for like 3 nights. And this was all for me. I mean, not for me in specific, right? But for a position. So again, a demonstration that even though universities appear to be very slow and hesitant and ignore certain kinds of students' demands, right? The university flourishes because of students like them. The university flourishes primarily because students want to make meaning out of their experience in college. I realized that from day one, and to this day, I keep on thinking about it, and it's always informed my work. It's really about making sure that strangers who come to our campus get welcomed to our campus. They don't know our campus. We have to send strong messages to them that this is their school, and I always do that every time there's orientation. I tell the students, this is your school, this is a public school, this is the state's university, this is yours. So if you want to change it for the better, it's up to you. I mean, I'm not putting all the labor on your end. Of course, I need to work on that as well, right? But you can have a voice in that one, right? In changing the very place that you think invisibilizes you, oppresses you, you think devalues you. You need to complain. You need to tell people like me if you're being treated like that, because we have the capacity to change. I think the trouble with a lot of schools is that we always talk about recruiting the most diverse student population, but we ourselves don't change. We're not diverse. We remain the same. The shell is the same. The new people who come to our campuses, students from places we've stereotypically not heard about, right? Places like Bhutan, Hmong students, we don't know their histories, right? We should know, because they're coming to our place, right? And then we blame them if they don't succeed. That's kind of shitty, right? I mean, we're setting up an environment in which students fail, right? And we shouldn't be doing that. Anyway, so that's my intro. That's something that's, that's my guiding kind of set of principles as a professor. I have other lives. I swim every day, and I play with kids every weekend. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to be with you all. First, Rachel and Tanya, thank you for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of it. And second, wow, these backstories. I feel like I just want to ask more questions, and it's just real heartening to know your stories. So I'll share a little bit about my story. I was born and raised in Queens, New York. Anyone here from Queens? Always, without fail. The Queens diaspora is vast. And I have, I've always had a really ambivalent relationship with Queens. Ambivalent, not in the sense of having mixed feelings, but profoundly conflicting ones. Because on the one hand, I found it really provincial. Like, it was The neighborhood was tight-knit, and there were all these qualities about it that just seemed so provincial compared to, say, like Manhattan, which was just a subway ride away, or even Brooklyn. And at the same time, it was worldly in ways that were profound. So if you look at like my first grade class photo, for instance, you had kids who were from, they escaped the Iranian Revolution, right? It's kids who were refugees from Vietnam. We had Taiwanese American kids like me who were the product of the 1965 Immigration Act, and then Chinese Venezuelan kids whose parents and grandparents had immigrated to the Southern Cone decades earlier. So it was worldly, but at the same time, I thought it was really provincial, like there wasn't a story here. But there was a profound story there. At the same time, in the part of Queens that I grew up in, which was called Jamaica, Queens, and Jamaica's broken up into 3 different sections. There's Jamaica proper, which is more like working class, historically African American and West Indian. There's Hollis, which is more like new immigrant, multiracial, and there's Jamaica Estates, which is white and wealthy. In that area, which is all I kind of knew growing up, there were these incredible stories, right? How did we all get there? I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't really care to know how we got there. And it was only later that I realized that within that community was the story of the Great Migration of African Americans to the North. Was a story of post-1965 immigration. Was a story of the fallout from the Cold War. Right? And it was only because I got lucky in college that I found professors who knew about Asian American history, who knew about African American history, who knew about critical migration studies, that I was able to piece together the story of how profoundly cool my Queens was. Because I would have gone on thinking that, I came from this really provincial place, all right? When I was 13 years old, I was playing basketball in a neighborhood schoolyard in Jamaica Estates, Queens. The better basketball courts were in Jamaica Estates. A man pulls up in a Rolls Royce. He rolls down his windows, he calls me and my friends over, and he says, "Hey, would you like to earn a few bucks?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure." And we kind of knew who this guy was. I said, "What do we got to do?" He's like, "Well, you've got to put these newspapers on all the cars in this parking lot of a local parish, the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church where we play basketball. And I want you to open up the newspaper to page 4, which has my ad." All right, cool. How much do we get? $10, fine, let's do it. So we put it all on all the cars. And the head of the parish sees us doing this. He's a really cool guy. He comes out, the priest, and he says, "What are you boys doing?" And we're like, "Fred Trump has asked us to put these newspapers on all the cars because he's, presumably, I didn't know it at the time, because he wants tenants from the church. And the church is predominantly white ethnic." Only years later did I realize what I was doing for Fred Trump, which I was contributing to his discriminatory housing practices. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I say all this because in that provincial neighborhood of Queens, New York, are all these stories which go on to impact the world, but we don't know them unless we have educators in institutions like the University of Washington, Tacoma, who can help you piece it all together. And that's really what we're here to do.
Thank you. Yeah. We have more questions, but I do want to just, for our students, draw on some themes just with our introductions and the stories of our panelists. We hear themes about bifurcation, as students living in two different worlds, right? Predominantly white institutions, learning environments versus our communities and our homes, and that disconnect that it can create. Many folks are familiar with the theme of no history, no self, N-O, versus no history, K-N-O-W, no self. That matters a great deal, and why we have to have diverse educators. I hear about histories of exclusion and erasure, both invisibility and hypervisibility, the power of representation, the challenge of mistaken identity, this overarching a notion that all Asians belong to one particular ethnic group, and how difficult that is to navigate. Also, how powerful it is to contextualize your stories with history, with the politic of imperialism and war, and our national narrative and rhetoric, both then and now, in terms of how we do or don't regard Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Most importantly, agency and voice. I know that over time, your stories become more powerful when you tell them. And as accomplished professionals, I think it's a very different thing to tell your story now than maybe the way you would have told it 30 years ago. And so I really appreciate that, and I thank you for that. And I really hope our students are listening closely, because this is your work too, right? To hone your stories and be able to tell your stories with courage and with conviction, so that you can also change the world. So this leads into then question number 2. And I think, Dr. Bonas, I think you got a head start on this already a bit. As faculty members and leaders and advocates and community members now, how do you disrupt business as usual, since you do have a strong sense for equity, the need to change policy and practice? What does that look like for each of you in your institutions? And I want to give a caveat that not to burden faculty of color in particular as if that work only belongs to us, but it's everybody's work, and that's our goal here today, is to develop, I think, the capacity and the practices for disrupting when we see it, learning to see it in the first place. But what does that look like for each of you in terms of institutional change?
I don't know if we're going to keep going in this order or not. I guess I'll just for now. I don't know if we'll keep going in this order, but I'll just go first. And I'm not sure, first of all, what you said sounds much better than what we said, so thank you. But secondly, I have a couple of points, and I'm not sure they're going to exactly answer your question, but I've just been thinking about them during the last 5 minutes, so I want to bring them forward. I work at Western Washington University. I drove down last night after work about 6 o'clock and got down here at 8 because I wanted to be able to zoom into some meetings. Usually Tuesday mornings is the meetings with the Council of Deans and the Provost. And today we had a special meeting with vice presidents of the university about budget and student projections, et cetera. And to get to the point, one of the things that was talked about was student retention rates and students dropping out of the university, and how can we think about this differently? And one of the vice presidents said something really, I think, powerful that I want to share with you. And what she said was, that those students that we're not retaining them, or they're failing, right? They haven't failed, we've failed them, right? Meaning we haven't created the systems in place that engage them, that support them in deep and meaningful ways. So I think that's a flip on thinking about what is the deficit in the students and how can we root out those deficits versus how can we change our systems? Because that's a fundamentally different way of approaching the way in which we engage as the university. And I just thought that the vice president who brought it up, that was helpful for me, for a helpful frame. I said earlier that I really did not have faculty of color in my experience as a student. And what I find of interest is that sometimes now I have students who come up to me and say, "You're the first person I've had as a person of color who is a teacher." And that has meant a lot to me. So that is a random point, but I just want to come back to, in my own life, how I see my agency, my way in which I can connect with students is impactful, right? So I want to just note that point. Late Friday afternoon, this past Friday afternoon, I was sitting in my office, I was trying to wrap up things, and it was about 4:45, roughly, 4:50, I remember the time, and somebody brought a student to my office. It was a second floor, so it's kind of like you wouldn't go there unless you were trying to get there. It's kind of hidden in the back. And the student was in distress. The student was, I would say, visibly kind of shaking. They led with, I'm really hungry, right? I haven't eaten all day, and this is 4:45, right? I haven't eaten all day, and he just kept saying it. And then he started talking about that his car had a boot put on it, and he had to go pick up his child at daycare, and he couldn't get there. And he just seemed really anxious and nervous and stressed, and all of those things. And I wasn't really sure what to do. Instinctually, I knew, let's just sit down. Let me get you some water. And maybe about 3 to 5 minutes later, one of our faculty who had known the student was coming because they were outside, we have a food pantry in our college, brought a box of food with cold food and dry food and yogurt, brought it up to my office and said, I have something for you. And I said, let's eat. Wait, so I got a spoon and the person ate some yogurt, and within about 5 or 10 minutes, you could just see that they just felt better. They just started to breathe more comfortably. They started to make more sense in terms of what they were saying. They could just rationally think because they weren't so hungry anymore. And I share that story with you, thinking about our conversation today, thinking about representation, thinking about curriculum. Obviously, in this particular case, this was a powerful story for me around hunger, a student's hunger, our charge, our responsibility as faculty members to pay attention to what our students are saying to us, either verbally or physically by their presence. And I use this also as an analogy beyond hunger as in food, but hunger as in knowledge, right? What are our students saying in terms of what would they like to see in the curriculum, their own representation, in deep and meaningful ways, threaded throughout the courses we offer. So,
Thank you. Just have tears in my eyes, and thank you for being there for the student. I'm an emotional person, so I'm trying to hold back my tears, but beautiful. Thank you. This is, okay, now I hear myself. Thank you. I know what you mean now. It's just like, oh my goodness. I wanted to share a little bit, not so much about here at UWT, but at my previous institution where I almost lost my job for being with students. And for a little bit of context, again, here I am, first-gen college student back in the day, and had there weren't a lot of faculty of color at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, but I was a course short of a minor in Black Studies, and also as a graduate student at the University of Illinois, had faculty of color who also supported students of color, so that's always been a special part of my heart. So for brief context, at the time, I was a department chair of the largest university on campus and one of just a handful of faculty of color. So in February of 2016, some of you might remember the name Philando Castile. So I was teaching at a private university in the Twin Cities, and like many of you know, Minnesota, right? Minnesota nice. They think they're not racist because they have friends of color and so forth, because they eat ethnic food. It was a really interesting place. But during that time, there was just a lot of shock because it was so close to home. But as we all know, police violence and brutality against racialized bodies is nothing new, right? This was before Trayvon Martin. Hey, folks, this was before Rodney King. This was before Emmett Till. This is just foundational to our nation's consciousness. But again, because it was so close to home for us as a campus community, our students were hurting, right? There was a local NAACP chapter, a local BLM or Black Lives Matter chapter, and across the color line, there was coalition building to demand justice for Black lives. So one day, a group of student leaders came to my office and to my other colleague, who's also a faculty of color, and said, hey, would you two, we talked about many things, but one of their asks was, can you put a BLM poster on your office door? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, sure. So, and the other ask was, well, can you also see if other faculty and staff would also put up the posters on the office door? I'm like, sure, okay, so it was a little late. So I put my sign on my office door, and the next day, I was gonna hand out the rest at a faculty and staff meeting. I got called into a white woman's office who was above my pay grade, and she said, Rachel, you need to take that sign down because A, it's making a lot of us feel uncomfortable. I'm like, oh, okay. And the other one was, and it's just really so inappropriate to have partisan signage, in such a public space. And I'm like, okay. So she goes, you need to take that sign down. And so I was like, okay, she's messing with the wrong person, okay? But I was a department chair. Even though I had tenure, the few faculty of color who spoke out against these issues were often subject to extreme retribution. So I put on my administrator hat, trying to speak administrator to administrator. I said, you know what? I will take down my sign. I said, but let's look down the hall here. I says, a lot of my white colleagues have all sorts of partisan signage on their office doors, lesbians for life, I love Hillary, blah, blah, blah. And I said, so you know what? I will gladly take down my signage if you make everyone else also take down their signage. Dead silence. I started to get excluded from meetings. I got kind of negative performance reviews, but I'm like, they can fire me or tell me to step down for administrative role. And really quickly, there's a second part to the story that gets more interesting. So you might have heard that after what happened to Mr. Castile, he was shot by a Falcon Heights police officer dead in front of his partner and his 4-year-old daughter, right? It's awful. So across the Twin Cities, again, across the color line, they were stopping traffic. They were holding up I-94, right? There was massive protests. So the same woman who just, told me to take down the signage suddenly says, Rachel, can you come in? And I'm like, I'm gonna get fired today. She had the nerve to say, Rachel, I can tell people are really upset. She wanted to send out a statement about how she cared about racial justice. And I was like, wow, this is rich, right? And I said, you know what? I would just, since you're asking me for my opinion, it'd probably be better not to send anything out. She didn't listen. She sent out this really lame, performative, stupid, ahistorical, oh, I'm so surprised by, and all this stuff. And students reamed her a new one, right? I said, I tried to tell you, right? But again, this is emblematic of what I think is the responsibility. I was given that mentorship and guidance as a student. This was something that, turned into like this policing about policy, right? So I was really a little uncomfortable, but I thought, you know what? If they fire me, they can fire me, and I can still go back to being faculty and write about this and have some fun. So again, not fun at whose expense, right? But that's a moment where I think faculty of color, leaders of color, we really need to be with and stand by students and to really, because nothing that we do in education is neutral. Whether you're in engineering, writing studies, education, criminal justice, right? Everything that we say and do, and on the contrary, the things that we don't say or the inactions that we take says a lot about who we are and what we value. Right, and so I just remember that like it's just like this movie scene in my head where I just thought, wow, and you can see kind of the tracing that. It's just like, wow, being penalized for the signage, and then I get asked to help this this Karen who kind of made her own mess, and I'm like, you can clean that up. That's not my mess to clean up.
Thank you. I want to echo what Kevin said about being anti-student deficit model, and instead, I don't mean to shade the institution, but think about institutional deficit, right, in that case. To follow up on what I said earlier, the demographics of our universities are changing, right? Newer and newer, more diverse student body, they're coming in. For the most part, especially in elite universities, the faculty demographics have remained the same. Sometimes the staff demographics have changed, but other times they've remained the same. Curriculum has largely been the same. The models of teaching, definitions of student success, student failure, that model has been with us for 500 years, right? And yet we expect all these students who are coming into our system based on a model that's not really their culture, based on a dominant model of education that they don't really belong to, but they're part of our society now. Do we expect them to succeed? They won't succeed in a place in which it's set up so that it's against their culture, right? They will read on historical figures who don't look like them. I'm not replacing a center with another center. They need to learn Shakespeare. They need to learn Western classical civilization. But they also need to learn about the Vietnam War. They need to learn about, cultures from different places, right? Which make up their population, their demographic. So if there's such a thing as a structural deficit, for so many years now, despite the fact that we have had some success in recruiting a lot of diverse students into our campuses, our models have remained the same. Our teaching methods have remained the same. And yet we wonder why we have low retention numbers. We wonder why they don't graduate on time. That whole model of explaining non-graduation and non-retention cannot be blamed on the students, because they're the victims of the very model that we have not changed for hundreds of years. And very, very few people in education scholarship think about that, changing structurally the system. Why? Because it's hard to think too. It's hard to get out of the dominant models by which all of us have been trained in anyway also, right? And so we have to force ourselves to sort of look at schooling in a different way. Think outside of the box, listen to the students. Students bring in knowledge to the classroom. I tell this to my students from day one. I am not the only source of knowledge in this classroom. All of you are, right? I'm not saying you should work because I get paid and you don't, right? That's the reality. But at the same time, I want to give them voice. I want to make them feel like they're a part of our knowledge creation and production. That's a model that's not been here with us for a long time. That's a kind of a new model. This whole thing about student-centered teaching, that came up like 5 years ago, right? And yet we haven't even perfected that because there are so many ways to do it. And so far we have failed, I think. And that's why when we have retention programs that center on fixing the students, I always shake my head. You're not gonna fix the students. You're just gonna make the students assimilate to a culture that they don't really like. You're gonna force them to behave like dominant culture people. Some of them will do that. They will succeed. Fantastic, right? But the vast majority of them will give up on school. They will leave. I don't blame them, right? So if there's such a thing as structural change, there are many models. Schools move at a very, very slow pace. You are lucky here that the chief diversity officer of your campus is the chancellor of the campus. In many other campuses, the chief diversity officer is a person who is not the head of the campus. Sheila here is experienced in diversity stuff, and yet she's the head of your school. On my campus, I know this is dissing Seattle a little bit, right? I opposed the dean when she said, the dean of College of Arts and Sciences, when she said, I want to appoint a new dean to handle diversity. And I kind of told her privately, I said, you know what? In my opinion, the buck stops at the chairs, the dean's office. Diversity has to be taken care of by the boss, right? reminds me, I know this is sort of a capitalist sort of dig, but when the Safeco CEO said, there is no vice president for diversity at Safeco, the CEO, right? He said, I am the president of diversity. I am the CEO and I'm the CEO of diversity. That sent a strong message to everybody that diversity is not one aspect of the school. Diversity is everybody's business. That's one model not all schools do take, right? And so in a way, structural sort of change is possible. We need everybody's buy-in. Everybody needs to rethink how we do schools. And I know that's a tall order because it's hard to face change, right? The governor of Florida says that every day. He doesn't want to change. He wants to go back to how it was in the good old days, right? And yet in his very state, the numbers of the demographics are changing every day, daily, right? Newer immigrants are coming in. They're going to be in their school systems. Imagine what they will face, right? So that's my advocacy. I know that, and again, structural change, it's complex. There's so many angles to it. There's so many strands. Assessing structural change is very hard to do. What Ana PC does is fantastic, but it's just one piece of the pie, right? And oftentimes, sometimes we fall into that thinking again that students need to be repaired. I disagree with that wholeheartedly because I think students are not failures, right? As you've said, right? It's the school that fails the students. They're the ones who are coming into our institutions. They don't know what we've been doing for the past 500 years. We need to provide them with an environment in which they will succeed, right? That's why for a lot of students that I work with, I know they're very interested in what's the career to have after college, but really their number one, if you ask them, if you have longer conversations with them, they want to find meaning in their school. They want to discover who they are. And if we don't have teachers who enable them to do that, who encourage them to do that, who don't know how to encourage students to do that, we're going to fail them over and over again. And so, that's my advocacy, and that's the students' advocacy that I also talk about in the work that I do.
So I'm going to reinterpret the question that Tanya asked by asking what is the point of Asian American studies in higher education? We're all Asian Americanists. And one might say that it's about being more inclusive in higher ed. And it's about making students feel more included by having their stories reflected in the curriculum. I would actually object to that reasoning for it. I don't think it's about inclusion or necessarily about students' self-esteem. I think it's about quality control over the curriculum of higher education. I think it's about producing better knowledge for all of us. Not that inclusion and self-esteem don't matter, but as somebody who's been doing this for nearly 2 decades, I have to say that the role of Asian American studies in higher education is to produce better ideas across the disciplines. Mm-hmm. Rick, you used a phrase that I couldn't get out of my head as you were winding down, and that was how some people don't want anything to change, right? The word trauma is used widely in the current political and cultural lexicon, and one of the definitions of trauma that I find really interesting is trauma is that which won't change. Trauma is that which is reiterative, that won't become something else. And so when I think of Asian American studies, I think of the need to have a less traumatized higher education curriculum, meaning how can we take concepts that we are so dead set on and ways of understanding the world that we're so fixed on and put them in a different way. because that's ultimately what we're supposed to do in higher education. We're supposed to move knowledge forward. So let me be a little bit more concrete about what I mean. Would you say that carceral studies and mass incarceration is an important topic? Would you say that immigration and refugee migrations are important topics across the disciplines? Okay. Would you say that understanding indigenous lands is an important topic across the disciplines? Well, you can't really get to all of those topics in a deep and profound way without Asian American studies and other critical ethnic studies. For instance, you couldn't really understand how mass incarceration plays out in the 1970s unless you understand how new immigration and the model minority myth intersect with that. How so much punitive social policy against African Americans is predicated on what? On the false celebration of Asian American successes, as Asian Americans as paragons of liberalism, right? Well, isn't it true, Dr. Tang, that they are paragons of liberalism? Well, to an extent, only because the state manufactured produced which immigrants they wanted through the 1965 Immigration Act. So you're not going to really get a deeper analysis of anti-Blackness and carceral, and the carceral state unless you understand new immigration. You're not really going to understand the nuances of settler colonialism unless you understand the role that Asian Americans play in settler colonialism in places like Hawaii. You're not going to understand what it means that the United States is the most generous refugee resettlement country in the world, because it resettled the most numbers of refugees, unless you really read what happened with the Refugee Act of 1980, which resettled more than 1 million refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. So how can you possibly understand all these things that we all agree are central to the humanities curriculum unless you have Asian American studies? Now let me go back to the point around our students. Once you do that across the disciplines, I think you'll retain your students. I think they'll feel more included, not because you were being charitable, but because you allowed them to make your curriculums better.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your generosity and for sharing your stories. I feel like when I think about the questions we set, we're a bit ahead because you're integrating a lot of your responses into other themes that we wanted to bring up. I will say I appreciate really that paradigm shift of thinking our students in terms of assets and not deficits. The notion of co-constructing knowledge as educators, both the faculty, staff, and students in the room, all of us are teachers in some capacity, really requires trust and vulnerability on our part to give space for students to participate in knowledge creation. I think that's so important, and it brings equity to the classroom and it shares power. I appreciate also the comments about how important history is and that context for history. And you mentioned that, students should learn about the Vietnam War. Well, of course, but we should learn about the Vietnam War from a Vietnamese perspective, starting with the fact that most Vietnamese don't call it the Vietnam War, right? So that's really important. And lends to, I think, a more critical understanding about what we talk about when we say inclusion. Also, I'm hearing that, and this can't be said enough, that it's just really important to listen to people of color and indigenous communities. Often, I think we share this experience where our advice is sought behind the scenes, behind closed doors, or in a secret email, and then later that's brought forward as if it's someone else's knowledge. Like, if you want change, we have to be at the table. We need to be in the room. And again, to Dr. Tong's point, thank you so much for really framing Asian American studies as a practice, a curriculum, field of study that is disruptive, that does challenge institutional racism, because we are giving our students the education they need, right, to see things in a more critical light. And you're right, it does draw students in so that they can explain their own histories and understand, right, their place in the world. Lastly, I'll just finish with something light, and I think this might be mythical, but it's always been true in my household. For Asian communities, our greeting is not, how are you, what do you do for a living, it's, have you eaten yet? And so I really appreciate the story about even addressing the dynamics of student hunger and food insecurity. That is central in terms of making sure that our loved ones have nourishment, and that their well-being comes first. And all of that, for me, is wrapped up in your answers around not just disrupting institutional practices that are oppressive, but what do we replace it with? And that's an ethic of care. And that is what holds students, right? So I know I'm going to watch our time because I want to make sure our students in particular have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm just going to ask one more and maybe brief answers. Actually, I'll give you a choice. Maybe could you respond to how you're feeling and thinking about some of those national dynamics and politics? For example, anti-Asian violence that has increased, the increased media coverage of anti-Black violence, our calls for abolition, certainly the horrific work and narrative and rhetoric around our southern borders, some of those pressing issues that impact our communities. If you could comment on how you're thinking and feeling about that, but also, and maybe this will come across in our Q&A, what words of advice do you have for our students, in particular our students of color and our Indigenous students, in terms of how to navigate historically predominantly white institutions and how to make this place your own?
So this is, I guess, an extension of my last set of comments. And let's consider, anti-Asian violence and the rise in so-called hate crimes against Asian Americans as another national topic that we could teach across the disciplines. Some of you might be familiar with the hashtag #StopAsianHate, which went viral during the pandemic after all these reports of racial violence against Asian Americans started coming in, and we started to analyze it. And as we began to analyze the data, what we found was that there was very little that the state could do to prosecute many of these so-called hate crimes, because when you looked at the facts of the case, they didn't actually rise to the occasion of a hate crime, meaning that the perpetrators didn't necessarily say something that was hateful. Mm-hmm. There wasn't this concrete kind of evidence. The evidentiary threshold that was needed to prosecute somebody on a hate crime wasn't there. And in fact, the most egregious of all of these crimes, which was the Atlanta shooting, is the case in point. Robert Aaron Long, the shooter, never actually said anything hateful about those he murdered. And he has yet to be prosecuted or punished for a hate crime. The thing is, not many people know that because no one really follows the details of the prosecution. But Georgia hate crime statutes, which were passed, right, after Aubrey was murdered, was not applied to Robert Aaron Long in Georgia, astonishingly. Why? Because the prosecutor said, well, he actually didn't say anything explicitly racist or sexist. All right, full stop. Where does this leave us? What leaves us with, from, let's say, legal studies, right, needing to think more critically about whether or not these hate crime statutes actually work. Mm-hmm. So here, Asian American Studies has a key role to play in legal studies, right? It also forces us to ask whether or not hate is the thing that we need to be looking for when we talk about stopping Asian hate. Hate in this kind of surface, obvious way that is required by prosecutors. Perhaps hate isn't quite the thing, but something else is in play. Mm-hmm. We might call it racial desires. If a person is obsessed with his victims, does he hate them according to the law? Perhaps not. But is there something else in play that we need to start paying attention to? And here is where I think critical theory, literary theory, as well as the extent to which those fields intersect with the psychoanalytic, also benefit from Asian American studies. You get what I'm saying? Like, this is the kind of thing that we need to push on. And then from there, we have to think about what exactly this means for sociology and gender studies, because what happened is that these women who were targeted in a specific racial and gendered way that has everything to do with who they were as migrant workers and the role they played as sex workers. Asian American Studies pushes on that as well. We haven't even begun to have these conversations yet. And so part of what I feel I would encourage all of us to do is bring Asian American Studies into our curricula, even if you have no Asian Americanists on your faculty. Because again, you're not going to be able to get to these issues that are central to our political and cultural discourses unless you do.
Hello. Okay. This might sound a little bit in contradiction to my appeal for advocacy, like to do advocacy work for everybody, but I'm going to combine Tanya's questions together. So one is, how do I feel about all of these horrible stuff that's happening? I feel enraged, right? And then what is my advice to a young person like me? Like, okay. I think that we often forget that pleasure in what we do is important. So I want to encourage everyone, amidst all of the hate, to not forget that college can be fun. Like going to school can be fun. I love teaching. I love interacting with students. I want to highlight that to make sure that that doesn't get lost in the equation of our work-life balance. I always tell my students, to try to look for pleasurable stuff in whatever it is that they're studying, because that will carry you a whole lot farther than thinking about all of the hate. Not that I want you to not advocate against hate. Of course, that's very important work. And that's in connection to what my second advice will be. So one is to have fun, because I think that's important. And I think it's good for work-life balance, and it's good for our health, right? The second advice that I would give is to pick your battles. Nobody told me this when I started advocacy work, and now I'm very tired. And so I would advise my younger self, okay, Rick, not every hateful thing that you see around the world, you can lead the advocacy against. Because you're one person, and there's a community of us, or communities of all of us, who can work together against hate. Often now I think of which things I need to focus on instead of focusing on everything. And all of you know this, right? Because it's almost like you don't want to tire yourself. If you're in for the long haul, you cannot survive after 3 years and still stay healthy if you're fighting all the battles everywhere, right? If you're angry every day, or if you're doing petitions and protests every day, right? That's very, very tiring. And so I would tell myself, you know what, just pick. You don't need to do everything, right? And, and it will come with if you do everything, obviously it will come with a cost, right? I mean, I delayed my promotion to full professor for a long time because I was I'm not blaming, I'm not saying that I regret that. I'm just saying that I would have been a better, sort of advocate if I had more energy during certain times in certain places. So those are my pieces of advice to the little Rick bonus.
The young Rick bonus. And I agree, there's just so much going on. And I would also encourage us to trouble this notion of the current moment, because racialized violence is so ingrained in our nation's consciousness, right? But one thing that has particularly been disturbing and that I think has been really important when I think about higher education and the connection to K-12 is, does everyone know what's going on with the AP board and the AP African American Studies pilot, right? It's a mess, and I would say that, just for those of you who may not be aware, I would look into that, but basically there was a pilot for, after the summer of 2020, there was this movement to pilot AP African American Studies, and the Florida governor has just been on the spin of really trying to delegitimize it, right? And so as a dean of education, it's just like horrifying, because censorship and erasure has just been part of the narrative for as long as I can remember, and for centuries and centuries. But what I think about is, so then what is my responsibility? And what I find myself doing is often, I've had people on this campus say, you know what, I really don't like DeSantis, but I kind of agree with him. African Americans are American, they don't need the separate AP, this or that, and it's just like, wow, that's really unsettling to me. And so I have to think about these as teachable moments, and you're right, we have to be careful about burnout. And so every moment like this is a teachable moment for me. And so I wanted to briefly share the Association for Asian American Studies, the National Organization for Asian American Studies. They released a statement in defense and support of AP African American Studies. I just want to read parts of it because I think it's really important for this conversation today, and also for us as a campus, and about how, again, we really need to support ethnic studies across the board. They say, we write as educators and community members in defense and support of an AP African American Studies that reflects the intellectual project of Black studies. They talk about their outrage about DeSantis, his move to reject the AP pilot of an African American Studies course. They talk about the attack on the AP curriculum as part of a broader strategy to police Black educators, as well as delegitimize education around the enduring impact of racism and injustice in our society. And they talk about ethnic studies courses and programs across the nation, including Asian American studies, were born from struggles of multiracial coalitions across the country. And this also makes me think about what you shared about your experience. On most college campuses, this was primarily rooted in the student activism of Black student unions and other Black student organizations. And there's a lot of articles out there in the media and press about this. But especially, there's this big boogeyman about intersectionality. And in this one article by Vox, The Controversy Over AP African American Studies, talks about there's actually been in the pilot some content around intersectionality, especially around Black feminism and the connection to Asian American and Chicana feminism. And they're just like, that's a boogeyman, right? And so this is why, for me personally, I think about, wow, this is why the cross-racial solidarity piece is so important. And again, there's so much going on that, we can spend years rehashing and thinking about those moments. But again, for me, it's about raising public awareness. And again, in those micro moments with our neighbors, with our own loved ones, with our colleagues, when you hear things like that, just don't remain silent, right? Interrupt it a little bit. But don't blame and shame, because when you do that, people shut down. And so you might say, tell me more about what you're thinking. Because when I heard I don't like DeSantis, but I kind of agree with him, I was like, oh my goodness, I had my own reaction. So that's mine. And advice to students, keep being you, you rock. That's why we all are here as faculty and staff. We see you, we hear you, and we're proud of you. So keep being you.
So I know I'm supposed to be short, and I have a couple of notes, and they probably don't make any sense, but I'm going to give this a go. I mentioned earlier that my mom was one of 17 children. She was the third oldest, first one to leave the Philippines for the United States to find work. She immigrated about 60 years ago, and then she met my father, and then they got a house and started to have children, etc. And over time, then, my house became like a clearinghouse for our relatives who were going to migrate after my mom. So an auntie, an uncle, a relative, somebody who lived in their town, they'd stay with us for months or years They became kind of my de facto brothers and sisters, depending on how long they were in our house, just as they found their footing or found their own house or found a job, etc. A lot of my mom's friends, a lot of them were nurses or doctors. So a lot of those nurses became my de facto aunties when we didn't have our biological aunties around. My mom died 17 years ago. Between my fourth and fifth year of graduate school, I was about to do my dissertation. And since my mom died 17 years ago, these aunties are whispering in my ear all the time and always up in my business, pretending, for my mom. But I'm getting to the point. One, then they sometimes reminisce about my mom, and I learned things about my mom and their migration to the United States that I didn't hear from her directly. But one time, one of my aunties said to me, "You know what I really like about your mom is she didn't get in the bucket of crabs. She didn't play that game." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea." And what she said is, sometimes Filipinos could be like, and now I'm outing, Filipinos out there, but like bucket of crabs, they're in that bucket of crabs and they're gonna pull everybody down so they can get to the top. You wanna get to the top because you wanna kind of survive, or you wanna get yours. And your mom kind of tried to help other people. I share that because this idea of Asian American violence is something we think of external. People are doing things to Asian Americans, but I think it's something we do to ourselves. And we do it within groups of Asian Americans to each other, right? Across groups. And I sometimes think about, why do we play that game? Why do we pull each other down, whether it be within our group or across campus from other groups? And I won't ask you to do this, but imagine if we're in this bucket of crabs, and you're all the crabs out there, right? I'm not gonna ask you to do this, but imagine if you went to the right, you're right, to left, right, left, and we're all moving together. What's gonna happen in that bucket? It's gonna tip over, and we're all gonna be free, right? We're all gonna have access. We're all gonna be able to bind together to move forward, right? To seek goals, to seek commonality, right, over time. And I know it's a lot more complicated than that, but the other option is to keep fighting each other and keep pulling each other down. And that just has to stop, right? The system is set up actually for that to happen. So we just play into that system, and I hope this is making sense, this story, otherwise I'm an idiot. But anyhow, that we in these ethnic groups have to say, let's sit down together at a table. And yeah, okay, we don't agree on everything, but what are some things we can advocate for within this UWT system to meet the needs of our programs, of our students, to just stop fighting, right? I know it's more complicated than that, but I'll just leave with that. I think I'll say one more thing because I'll just monopolize the time. I used to have this really old phone. It was almost like the equivalent of a flip phone, just up until like 3 years ago. Now I have an iPhone. I don't understand what happens half the time, and sometimes it talks to me. I don't know what's going on. But there's this one app on it where you can track your steps, right? And people are nodding and say they probably do it all the time and look at it religiously. And I've been thinking more and more about this idea of steps, and thinking more and more about this work toward thinking about inclusion, thinking about Asian American studies, thinking about, just meeting our needs. And I guess I'm speaking to students in this case, and I'm speaking to faculty who are doing this work. And sometimes in this work of like trying to create curriculum or trying to create systems that meet the needs of our learners, we sometimes think we didn't have any steps today. Like we didn't make any traction. We didn't go anywhere, right? And sometimes we look at our phone and we think, man, we did a lot today. I can't believe how far I went, right? And I want us to think, whether you're a faculty member, a staff member, or a student kind of engaged in this work, I want you to think about every day you're doing something. And sometimes you're doing things that you just didn't even know you could do. And even though those days, keep pushing ahead is what I'm saying, even though those days when you're just doing just a little steps, or there's a few steps on that phone tracking you, that means it's when it was hardest, but you're still pushing forward. And maybe that day you were waiting for other people and you were pulling them along. Or maybe that day somebody was on your back and you were carrying them, right? Because you knew it was the right thing to do, and you just keep pushing on. So, thank you.
Thank you again to our panelists. We just have a few minutes, but I do want to encourage you to ask questions. I'd love to hear from students first. If you can stay for a few extra minutes, please do. For those of you that need to leave, again, thank you for being here. Please check out our website, AAPI Thrive, under the Chancellor's Initiative for more information about the grant projects. We also have extra food sitting out there that's been packaged and for you, certainly for our students as well, so help yourself. So if we can open it up, if there's maybe just one or two questions from the audience, and students, you know I'm looking at you, and this is when I see the tops of your heads, because you don't want to make eye contact, but are there any questions for our panelists today?
Hey, my name is Cisco. I'm a junior here at the... My name is Cisco. I'm a junior here at the UW Tacoma. I know we talked about a lot of issues today, like representation, incarceration, immigration, hate crimes, and one thing that we could do to combat it is understanding the history through things like critical ethnic studies. If you guys could recommend one work, like a book or a film, a podcast, an article, what would it be to inform us on one of these issues?
Mm-hmm. It's hard to name just one, I think.
Eric's book, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I said.
It's hard to
Unsettled.
name. Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's kind of challenging to name just one, but there are several. Historically, there have been, I use several texts for Asian American Studies. Ronald Takaki is a big one, right? If you haven't read him, a different mirror, and so, or even Strangers from a Different Shore, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a big one. In Asian American Studies, Su Cheng Chan's work, maybe in history, right? Mm-hmm. For more contemporary work, there's a whole lot. It's like a big field, and so there's a whole range of different. I mean, if I mention books, then I'm playing favorites, right? And so I'm an editor, I'm a series editor for a press too, and so if you look at Temple University Press books, there's a lot of, Asian American studies there too. General ethnic studies, critical ethnic stuff, there's a whole lot as well. There are certain textbooks that follow what we call the, you've eaten in a buffet, right? It's this whole thing about chapter 1, Italian Americans, chapter 2, Irish Americans, right? We generally, in ethnic studies, we generally stay away from that because that presumes a whole lot of non-interaction across different groups, right? And no one can profess to being experts of all of the groups that book covers anyway, right? So be wary of those kinds of things, right? For film, there's a whole lot of selection of documentary and even feature films that teach critical ethnic studies as well. Eric's book, that.
Yeah, Eric's book, Dr. Bonus's book.
Yeah, if you want to read
Dr.
about
Endo's book. We can create a list of resources. Actually, I think that's a plan for our website.
Right, that would be
as
good.
well.
Yeah.
And of course, there are the Association of Asian American Studies has numerous pages of resources and books. And take our classes. We'd love to see you in class. Yeah. Another question or comment? Yes, in the back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the really enriching comments and stories that you've shared. Kind of curious, what's something you're teaching, something you're currently active with on campus that you're excited about, especially pertaining to the concept of disrupting institutional racism?
This past Saturday, the Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University, we hosted 120 BIPOC teachers and teacher candidates. And I won't get into it, but it's around a foundation, the Martinez Foundation, encouraging people to enter the profession. who are BIPOC in order to increase representation. And throughout the day, there were just sessions put on by student teacher candidates and also recent graduates talking about identity formation and what are some things that they do in their practice. And I was able to attend the whole day, and it was just really enriching for people just to be in community together. Again, I'm just talking about teacher education here, about their experiences and how to keep doing the work and keep doing the good work, and things to read or things to try out in classrooms. And I feel like that was really energizing, I hope, for the group that came.
So I'm currently teaching a course, and I've been doing it for a few years, called Urban Unrest, and it looks at the major urban disorders throughout most of the 20th century in the United States. And I really love this course because the students are always bringing in new material. In fact, I don't know if you know who Jericho Sims is. He's a center for the New York Knicks, and speaking of trauma, I'm a traumatized Knicks fan because they haven't won since before I was born. But Jericho was a UT student, and he took this course. And I have a no screens policy, you know, like you just no laptops even. But he's in the back of the room, like, you know, watching Netflix. And I'm like, come on, dude, you're like 7 foot tall. You're as inconspicuous as Big Bird. And so we had this conversation. I'm like, you know, so I know you're gonna get drafted, but let's do something here. Like, where are you from? He's like, Minneapolis. This was before George Floyd. So, you know, we work on putting together a section on unrest in Minneapolis. Now, before George Floyd, Minneapolis was one of the most rioted cities of the 20th century. And it has everything to do with racial liberalism. It has everything to do with its progressivism. And we can kind of get into that paradox at some other point. But what was so great is that he got into it, I got into it. We wound up putting together a section that brought in, like, you know, Prince. It brought in, like, the union movement in Minneapolis. It was great. And so that's an example of how, you know, your students and their stories are going to make your curriculum better. They're the quality control that we need, right? So I'm really excited about that. And then the other thing I want to say is I think we should actually, you know, to go to Cisco's question, we should be teaching whole courses and definitely the new texts on the rise of white radicalism in the United States. The fact that we think that this is not the purview of Asian American studies or ethnic studies is ridiculous. I mean, so Bring the War Home is a book that one should read. There's another one that came out pretty recently, Bring the War Home, and Carol Anderson's White Backlash, White Rage. These are really important texts. I mean, like, they should be essential reading. If you want to understand January 6th and what happened, you have to read Bring the War Home. And, you know, we can tell Ron DeSantis that the name of the course is Western Civ.
This is a chapter of a book that I just wrote, but I help run a mentorship program for mostly Pacific Islander students and their allies. It's called the Pacific Islander Partnerships in Education. Our original name was Pacific Islander Mentorship Program. The acronym would have been really bad, and so we changed it to Pacific Islander Partnerships in Education. It's a very simple program. We just get together to study around the round table. We eat pizza, which is very bad, very unhealthy. But it's pleasurable, yes. But it's their time to just be students, like university students, studying with a professor. And for them, that's kind of meaningful. So I like studying with them as well. We gossip, we socialize other than studying, so it's not meant to be like a really formal space, but it makes school closer to being a home for them. A lot of our Pacific Islander students are oftentimes ridiculed when they're seen, when athletes, for example, are seen reading a book in the locker room. And so this is a safe space for them. It's a place for them in which they don't need to pretend like they're nerds or whatever. They're proud to be nerds, actually, and they want to study. It's also a place where they teach each other cultures and histories. You know, the Pacific Islands are very heterogeneous in terms of histories and cultures, and so they get to know each other as well. And we invite, any student is welcome, actually. We have a lot of African American students who join. Students, when they smell pizza, they're gonna come. And so we welcome them with open arms. And other professors have joined us as well, and other staff too. So that's something that is very close to my heart. I've been doing it for 15 years. And it's just, you know, it's amazing the ways in which students make use of university space and call it their own space, you know, also.
All right. We're at time, maybe a few minutes past. Thank you so much for staying and for listening with your heart and for being present. I hope that there's a lot for you to take away, to reflect on and think about in terms of the power of representation and lived experience and how we all belong here and why Asian American Studies is so important to our whole campus. So thank you again for being here. Thank you to the panelists. Have a safe trip home. Help yourself to snacks on the way out.